something about course credit. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our afternoon speaker for K-5 section, Dr. Sheryl Honig. Before that, I wanted to give you a little bit of other information. Some of you have signed up for course credit. Some of you are still trying to decide. You can still make the decision before the end of the day. That on your flash drives is the syllabus. So if you can, and they have internet or laptops, you may want to check there. If you want to check, if you want to try to figure out what is required for course credit, that's on the syllabus. It is on your flash drives, regardless of whether you're taking the course credit or not. That's where you'll find it at this stage. And then we will have some additional information, both Dr. Mandarino and myself, tomorrow afternoon when we finish about 3:30, 3:45 for about 20 minutes before, early in this conference, so you get a sense of, okay, there's a reflection, some lesson plans. This is what is expected for outside of the conference and when those are due, and we will cover that tomorrow afternoon after our breakout sessions. Okay? Also, information, so we're going to have Dr. Honig present on integrating language and content, particularly from a science perspective, in a few minutes. But after that, we will then, so I'm giving you an advance warning is that you may be moving after presentation because our intention was to get you into four different inquiry groups. Those will be text complexity, close reading, argumentation, and literacy leaders. So if we have enough to do K3 or 4-5, we'll do it that way. I think in this group we will probably want to break up. We may not do that in the secondary group, but FYI, after the presentation, we'll be moving into those four different inquiry groups so that you can focus in on an element of Common Core so that you can really try to then wrestle and begin to dig a little deeper into an element of the Common Core and do so with others, individuals at your grade level or closer to your grade level or at your specialty. So without further ado, Dr. Sheryl Honig is an assistant professor at the Department of Literacy Education at Northern Illinois University. Dr. Honig's research centers on children's acquisition of informational discourses. Her interest is to explore ways to measure children's vocabulary knowledge and to develop effective instructional vocabulary practices for primary grade children and across the content areas. So with that, I would like you to welcome Dr. Sheryl Honig.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's not a real gorgeous sunny day outside, so we're okay in here for a while, right? Mike and Corinne asked me to share my work in language-enriched science instruction that I've been doing in elementary grade classrooms, largely second grade classrooms. Now, my work is a work in progress, but this might provide an example for you of one way to think about how to plan a content area unit in the context of Common Core. So, in summary, Common Core says that students need all of this. They need the ability to gather, comprehend, evaluate, synthesize, and report on information and ideas, to conduct original research in order to answer questions or solve problems, and to analyze and create a high volume and extensive range of print and non-print texts in media forms, old and new. The need to conduct research and to produce and consume media is embedded into every aspect of today's curriculum. Now, that's a very expansive view of becoming literate in a content area in the primary grades, and I suggest that, yeah, we can begin doing this in the primary grades, and indeed we have to if we're going to have children ready for middle school content curriculum. I appreciate the focus on content in the Common Core. So when I'm thinking about science, piece one is the content. What is it that I'm going to be teaching? And by the way, there is a handout that Corinne will be bringing around, 4 pages. There's a longer handout on the Common Core Conference website. It's not on the flash drive. They put it on the website. So there are a few charts that you will see on the PowerPoint that aren't on here, but they are on our website. And Corinne, where's the PowerPoint? On the website or the flash drive? The PowerPoint.
I think it's on the website.
Okay.
It might be both, but it's definitely.
Is it on the flash drive? Okay, so my PowerPoint is all there too. Okay. So some examples of content that I have worked with: life cycle of a seed plant, water cycle, life cycle of chicken, butterfly, honeybee. What I have discovered as I have worked in grades 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in science is that this life cycle concept is something that is appropriate at all these grade levels as they spiral deeper and deeper into the connective, the systemic thinking about science and about cycles. So these are some examples of content that I might be covering in primary grades, maybe 3rd and 4th also.
These are in your folders apparently already.
Oh, okay. Now, the field has identified a very strong link between content learning and language learning, and that's where my passion lies. In fact, theorists and researchers have proven that learning the language of science is central in science education, the language of science. And scientific discourse represents a distinct way of knowing. As Dr. Shanahan was telling you, there is a science way of language and there is a social studies way of language. There's a chemistry way of language, right? So these are all unique discourses. And there's been a lot of research done on how to help children acquire this language. Instruction that features multiple entries for talk and writing around hands-on activities supports science language learning. And in my own research, I found that children who, in their writing about science, tended to use a wider range of vocabulary were also, interestingly, expressing more complex scientific ideas. There was a strong correlation. And so I wanted to look more closely at the role of language learning in science instruction. So piece 2, as I think about planning my unit, is the language. Okay, what does language do in science? Language functions on a spectrum in science, from data level language to theoretical language. Data level language is language around hands-on activity, around experiments, around demonstrations, around observations. And that kind of language is usually past tense, and it's about something that's right here in our hands that we can see. Theoretical language is language that's written about general categories of things, and usually we find that language in the books, okay, when we're learning science. Here are some examples of data level language in red and theoretical language in green. And this is on your handout, and I'd like you to think through these examples as I talk about them, because in a minute, I'm going to ask you to look at some student writing and see if you can see what students are doing with their science language. So, procedure would sound like plant the seed in the dirt. Observation would be the stem grew 6 inches. Both of them are data level thoughts. They're about objects that we're working with in our hands. Now, in the informational trade books or in the 2nd grade science textbook, you're going to find a lot of language that's theoretical. And all the green examples are theoretical. So, for example, you're going to have introductions to topics, clouds. You're going to have final summaries, and that's how the water cycle works. You will find descriptions of attributes. Clouds are full of droplets. Notice that we're not talking about a specific cloud that we're looking at. We're talking about clouds as a category. It's generalized language and it's present tense. Clouds are full of droplets. You're also going to read characteristic event. Rain falls on the earth. This is not narrative. It's science language that's describing a characteristic event that happens as a generalized idea. You will find definitions like evaporation is when water turns to vapor. Sometimes you will find explanation and sequence. These are rarer in elementary contexts. Think about it for a minute. In your experience, do you find elementary textbooks or teacher talk in science classrooms to consist largely of explanations and extended ideas? Typically, and research shows this, that language in elementary classrooms tends to be very factoidal, fact, 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 and usually just about attributes and events. How many of you have had children have to find 3 facts about something in a book, right? Science language tends to sound factoidal in elementary classrooms. And so children tend to acquire that language themselves. So when you look at their writing, you will find more lists of attributes and lists of events and not as many explanations of how or why. In fact, sequencing is hard to find when children are writing about cycles. And you would think that would be obvious that they would be writing sequences. But I'll show you some examples of student writing. Now, I'll show you some examples from trade books, okay? Here's an example of an observation. Control plants, which received both sunlight and water, both grew to 16 centimeters with dark green, healthy stems and leaves. Okay. Here's another example of a trade book that is using the language of observations and results. Again, it's tangible. It's about one particular object you're observing. It's not a generalized class of things. I found more of the shiny stuff on the soil and a dead leaf. I don't know what the shiny stuff is. The dead oak leaf has changed. It is smaller and darker than before. Okay. Both of those are examples of data level language. Now let's try some examples of theoretical language, where we're talking about generalized categories of things. So here's an attribute. Honeybees have a bright color pattern to warn potential predators. Characteristic event, honeybees collect pollen. Comparing categories. This can be done, all of these ideas can be expressed in diagrams as well as in text, but here we're comparing types of volcanoes. And here in text, we're comparing kinds of leaves. Okay? Here's an example of some text that does a better job of explaining how or why. I'm going to go to the second paragraph there. Roots also absorb air from the soil. That's why animals that dig burrows in the soil are so important. The burrows let air into the soil. If a plant's roots cannot get air, the plant will die. Now, you might think that it's curious that I'm drawing so much attention to these language functions in science. But think about the focus we put on language and narrative, right? We talk with children about the setting, the plot, the character, the climax, right? Children engage in that meta language about narrative all the time. Well, there is a meta language about science, and children take it up just as readily. So, in fact, if I were looking at children's writing in science, maybe I would actually want to consider, what are they doing with language? Is it scientific, the kind of language they're using? Do I see a lot of, oh, I love flowers. Flowers are so cool, you know? Am I seeing attributes? Am I seeing characteristic events? Am I seeing comparing of categories? And am I seeing children actually try to explain the life cycle, or explaining the role of the life cycle of a plant in a food chain? Or am I starting to see children explain the role of a plant in an ecosystem? Now, if we go back and look at this rubric, not only does it represent progressively more complex language functions, it also represents layers of systems thinking. In science, there's a concept called systems thinking. Systems thinking is the extent to which you can talk about an idea using interconnectedness from object to object, from process to process, from time to time, from place to place. So a low-level example of systems thinking might just be I can say that plants have leaves. I'm not really connecting that plant to anything, I'm just saying that it has leaves. If I can talk about how where those leaves come in the process of the life cycle, now I'm thinking about a bigger system. If I can talk about that plant and its leaves and the life cycle in an ecosystem, now I'm in a bigger system. So in science, that's something that's important, is to be able to think about scientific ideas in ever-widening systems and make connections. So there's conceptual complexity here, but there's also linguistic complexity here in science. And I might want to pay attention to that when I'm looking at students' writing, when I'm looking at my instruction, and maybe when I'm looking at the books that I'm picking out for the students. So let's pause for a minute, and I would like you to have talk space around this activity. But I'd like you, with the person next to you, to read through 3 student samples that are on your handout, 3 samples of students writing about the life cycle of a seed plant. Just at a first glance, I bet you can tell who has the most fluency with the science vocabulary and language. But I want you to look very closely and see if you can identify, do you see descriptions of attributes? Which sometimes I identify this with children as, what is it like? And characteristic events, what does it do? See if you can find those linguistic elements of scientific discourse in the children's writing. And also circle specialized vocabulary that has to do with the life cycle of a seed plant. And get a feel for the range that you're seeing among these students. We'll take about 10 minutes because I would really like you to get some practice with this meta language. Go ahead. If you are looking for the global elements, those are listed in the first chart on the first page, where it lists topic presentation, description of attributes, characteristic events. Those are the elements that you're looking for in the children's writing. But I believe it's important to know, what is language doing, especially when we're in first, second, third grades, and one of our tasks is teaching language. We're teaching children language. So first of all, we need to be aware of what it looks like in science. So what if I planned a unit on the life cycle of a seed plant with an explicit focus on vocabulary? Because remember, I saw this correlation in my research that the children with the widest range of vocabulary were also expressing more complex science ideas. Did you see that in the samples? Which child was better at linking multiple ideas into a sequence? It was also the child that was using a wider range of vocabulary. And remember when Dr. Shanahan said, you know, maybe the problem isn't that the child doesn't understand how to find the main idea. Maybe the problem is the vocabulary. Maybe the problem is he doesn't know how to find the main idea when reading about the life cycle of a seed plant. And I would argue that I would rather equip elementary grade students with language and prior knowledge to prepare them for the academic reading they're going to do in 5th and 6th grade. I would rather do that than focus on generalized skills like finding the main idea. I mean, you can do both, but I think language needs to be forefront in our thinking about preparing children for text. So if I planned a unit that explicitly supported vocabulary, would the children learn the science? Carolyn? Okay. Carolyn and I worked together as 2nd graders. Okay, this is what we know about vocabulary learning. First of all, it's incremental, right? There is no such thing as today I don't know the word stigma and tomorrow I do know the word stigma. We acquire knowledge of words gradually. We're always increasing how much we know about a word, how well we recognize it in different nuanced contexts. So if it's incremental learning we're talking about, then I'm going to want my children to have multiple entry points into using that language. Multiple entry points. So I don't want me to be in control of the language in the classroom all the time. I want there to be plenty of opportunities for children to practice this language at the point at which they're able to. Also, I'm going to want there to be multiple exposures because if learning vocabulary is incremental, that means a one-day shot isn't going to do it. So I want them to be exposed to the language in multiple texts, on multiple days, in text and in hands-on, in picture, in diagram. I want there to be multiple exposures to these words. I want there to be wide reading because I want them to encounter this language in other authors' phrasing of the language so that they're getting a more nuanced view and perspective of what the word pollination means and how you would use it yourself. Also, vocabulary learning is an interrelated kind of learning. So that means that if I already know what a mammal is, I'm going to be able to learn porpoise quicker. So knowledge of some words help us learn other words. Well, if that's true, I'm going to want to highlight that interconnectedness of the vocabulary of a seed plant. So I'm going to want to make sure I have graphic organizers that show the relationship among words. I'm going to want to have text sets where they're reading the same kinds of ideas and vocabulary by different authors. And I'm going to want to do some word sorting. Vocabulary learning is also multimodal. So I want children to be not just listening to me. I want them to be doing with the language, talking, reading, and writing. Now, inquiry is very compatible with this, isn't it? In inquiry, we start with student questions. Now, inquiry across the year looks different. At the beginning of your school year, inquiry is more guided by you. So after hearing student questions, you may select the question for the inquiry in that first unit. But over the year, that inquiry needs to belong more and more to the students. But inquiry itself means that we're starting with students' questions, and that provides a good entry point for them to use their language. You're forming a question, you're collecting data, you're forming conclusions, and when I say collect data, I don't just mean planting seeds and measuring them. I also mean collecting data from books, which again is theoretical language. So we want all that language to be part of inquiry. Inquiry is about reporting out. And to do inquiry, you have lots of talk space and lots of collaboration. This is very consistent with Common Core goals. All of those things, that's what Common Core wants students to be able to do with the language of science. They want kids to collaborate with others to research a question or research a problem and engage in the reading about it and then write about it and then report out about it. Science is a great place for this to happen. So I want to build background knowledge in my children about the life cycle of a seed plant, and I also want to build their language. So here's my thinking. Talking and writing will be central in each lesson. And I don't mean I'll be doing all the talking and asking some questions and they'll raise their hand and answer in fragmented sentences, right? I will also provide some explicit instruction about the content and how to partner read. And children will engage in inquiry and talk around text so that we have theoretical language going, and around materials so we have data level going. Now, to make this interesting, as I'm planning this unit, I am going to compare this to classrooms that are having their traditional textbook instruction going on. And before I begin teaching, I'm going to pre-test the children and just see, whoops, I wasn't going to show you that yet. If you were going to pre-test children on their language about the life cycle of a seed plant, what would you do to test them? I decided to do 3 things, and all 3 ended up with the same result, so you probably don't need to do all 3 because they all said the same thing. First, I asked the children to look at a picture like that. I made a poster, a collage of pictures on the topic. And I asked the students to write all the words they could think of that go with that, all the science words. That's the far left sample. The middle sample is me asking children one-on-one, how about if you tell me all the words you can think of? And then I created a picture pointing test to see what their vocabulary knowledge was. Now, the good news was I probably didn't have to test it 3 ways because the results of all 3 were highly correlated with each other. So just doing one of those would probably be sufficient to give you a good understanding of where their language and their vocabulary knowledge is on this topic. An interesting thing to add is that because I was doing a research study, I also pre-tested everyone on the PPVT. And the PPVT correlated with the results on these also. Interesting. Okay. So after getting that prior knowledge information, because I wanted to know how much they were going to grow in this vocabulary knowledge at the end, these are the instructional activities I incorporated into my unit. And I'm going to talk briefly about each one of these things. And on your handout, you have a chart that shows how I scheduled these activities into a unit. First of all, a science talk. Warren and Roseberry talk about, there's only one R in Roseberry in the last part, sorry. Warren and Roseberry talk about a science talk beginning a unit. A science talk is where you take an object. So if I was teaching the life cycle of a seed plant, I might, well, one option would be to have 3 different kinds of seeds on the floor. We'll all sit around and look at the seeds. Another option might be to have some seeds and a full-grown plant, maybe a flower, but we have some kind of object, and we're all going to sit around that object, and it's an opportunity for children to say what they notice and ask questions about it. Now, if it's the beginning of the year and you've never done this before, children may only be able to do this for 10 minutes. But the first time that I did this with a class, I told them, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to try to do it for 10 minutes. And after 10 minutes, we'll stop and see how it went. Well, the 10 minutes went by beautifully, and I stopped them and I said, "You've been doing a science talk for 10 minutes. Do you think you can do it for 5 more?" So you want to extend it just to the point that they're able to do it. By the end of the year, hopefully you've got a 30-minute conversation going. In that science talk, you want to facilitate with as little intrusion as possible. You are listening because you're getting ideas for the class inquiry question. You're also getting information on possible misconceptions that they might have. So I start a unit with that. Now, the second day of the unit, I spend the entire session in a read aloud, and on subsequent days, my read aloud only takes 10 minutes. In the second day of the unit, when I spend the whole class period on the read aloud, I'm highly selective of which pages I'm going to read from a book. So if it's the beginning of the unit, I might just be reading about germination. I am also modeling during this class period about how to read informational text, and that would depend on what your kids need. If it's how to find the verb in a complex sentence like Tim Shanahan was talking about, that might be your focus. It's really hard to imagine keeping a read aloud activity to 10 minutes, isn't it? It's really hard for teachers, and here's why the minutes are so important. We're talking about science instruction in early elementary. I know that you guys have trouble sometimes getting to science at all in a month. And this study was done during a 3-year, well, I did 2 studies in 2 separate years, but this was during a 3-year period when the school district had just adopted a new basal. So in reading. So what you understand by that is that they weren't doing this during reading time. They really could just be doing this during their science minutes. And science minutes are pretty limited, aren't they? Especially during the first 3 years of a new basal adoption. So, this valuable time that teachers really put a lot of focus in, yes, I am going to teach science for 4 weeks. You know, it's hard to get to science, but they really were going to commit to doing this. But really, 30 to 40 minutes was the best they could do, right? And again, they weren't using these texts in guided reading lessons. They weren't able to. So this was all going to happen in science. So we had to be very careful about how we used our minutes. So I encourage them, keep your read aloud to 10 minutes, because if you don't, you will get all the talk space. And we're trying to support language here. If we're trying to support language, the kids need to be talking, the kids need to be reading, the kids need to be writing. So use that read aloud time to be very focused and explicitly support what they need, and then let them engage. So the read aloud was always accompanied by this vocabulary visit. Each day, as I read my pre-selected 2 to 4 pages, I would ask kids to identify any science vocabulary they heard while I was reading. And if someone raised their hand and said germination, I would write it on a sticky and give the sticky to the child and say, where do you think it makes sense to put germination up there? And they would place the sticky where they thought it made sense. And we'd talk a little bit about what germination was. Now remember, vocabulary learning is incremental, so we don't have to cover it completely today. We're going to revisit that every day, and every day we can resort the words. So if we think that we see some terms that really kind of fit nicely together, we can resort them. So that's kind of going on with our read aloud. In addition, I created an idea chart. So after I would read some pages, because I was modeling how to partner read, we'd close the book and say, what was important about that? What do you remember that we read? And the children would share ideas. Now, remember, I'm only taking 10 minutes, so can I let everybody share? No, I really can't. But just as a modeling, I'd let 1 or 2 share, and I would write the idea that they gave me on a sticky, and then we would put it where it belongs. And almost always, the children's ideas were descriptions of attributes or characteristic events. A side note, when I was working with third graders who were writing about volcanoes, they would come to class with their journals from their partner reading the day before, and I would ask them to look at their journals and circle any places they saw where they had tried to explain something. And pretty soon they became aware of, I'm not explaining very much. I'm just listing factoids, cool facts about volcanoes. And that was very useful and very accessible to the students. They got it, that an explanation is something where you're explaining how or why. So this idea chart and the vocabulary visit was always in the room and connected to our read aloud. Now, what about the books? What books am I going to pick? Well, I'm going to be selective on the book that I'm using for my read aloud because I want to make sure I'm covering content that eventually gets to the whole life cycle. There's two ways to think about having books in your classroom for the partner reading for the kids. You could find 9 different titles or 6 different titles that you really like and have multiple copies of them. Or you could do what I did, and that's go to the library, grab 47 books, and bring them to the classroom. What did I do with the 47 books? Well, I kind of ballparked them in terms of levels, like reading group A, this stack would be perfect for you, but you can read any books you want. And group blue, this stack would probably be perfect for you, but you could read any book you want in their partner reading. Text complexity in the Common Core is, I'm not sure we know how to use that term, text complexity, really. I don't know if it means, does the complexity of the text make it harder to read or richer to read? And does it kind of also depend on what we expect the kid to do with the text? It's a tricky concept. What I've prepared here is a protocol, and this is in the larger handout for you. But this protocol is informed by the Common Core Appendix A. And Appendix A explains to you, I don't know if you've ever read Appendix A in the Common Core, but it explains what they mean by complex text. Part of what they mean is the lexile, right? It's the how long are the sentences, how many syllables per sentence. It's a mathematical formula that only partially gets at complexity. Besides lexile, there are these other terms that Common Core uses, like what is the depth of content covered in this book? What is the breadth of content? How much previous knowledge does this book demand of kids? Then besides the content, there's what kind of features does this book have? Then there's clarity, and Common Core talks about clarity in terms of layers of meaning. The best way I can illustrate what that might look like in science would be, we were reading about the life cycle of a bat, and some of our bat books were really informed by an agenda, a political agenda of conservation. So in those cases, there were some levels of meaning that we need to be aware of. There's also coherence in a text. And again, this gets to that troubling thing about the lexile. How do you make a text an easier lexile? You shorten the sentences. The problem is that when you shorten sentences, you take off helpful words like however, or after that, or because of this, so that this text becomes factoidal and choppy, which is harder to comprehend. So be aware of that clarity of the text sometimes requires sentences to be longer, and then that jumps it up a higher lexile, so this idea of complexity can be tricky. Also, in looking at text, we want to look at the structure of the text. And if it's science, those words on the left, the D-A-C-E, we want to look at what is this text doing? Is it primarily a list of attributes of something? Is there good, rich explanation in this text? And then finally, we want to look at what the vocabulary demands are of the book. Now, these are all things that are important to notice about the books that you use. But it's not really a good guideline by which to eliminate some books. I think, depending on your purpose, any book can be all right. It depends on what your purpose for the book is. But these are important aspects to be noticing when you're looking at text for kids. Here's an example of a book about the plant, the life cycle of a seed plant, and here in this book we have 2 pages on roots. Plants need water like all living things. A plant's roots take in water from the soil. They also take in nutrients that help the plant grow. Roots grow lots of little hairs. These hairs help the plant soak up water and nutrients. The water and nutrients move up the root into the stem. Compare that to this text, which has this many pages about the roots. Both of these texts are a 630 lexile. This text compares different types of plant roots. This text explains how a root is like a straw. This text explains how a root is like a towel. This text has more explanation in it. It's still a 630 lexile, but it's, in my opinion, a more complex text. However, I don't think that makes it harder. In fact, I think that makes it more accessible to kids. So I want you to know that this text is from a curriculum called Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading. And in that curriculum, they created 9 title text sets to go with each of their topics, and they're all very rich and something you might want to check into. Seeds of Science, Roots of Reading. All right, so text selection is a biggie. And then we will partner read, and you all probably have routines for partner reading, but in the instruction in this study, partner reading happened almost every day. So there would be the 10-minute read aloud, and then kids would break out. Half the kids would go do hands-on work with their plants and with the journal, and the other half would go do partner reading with the journal. So 30 minutes or 25 minutes out of 40, the kids were actually using the language of science to read and write and observe and do hands-on about plants. Journal writing happened after hands-on, and journal writing happened after reading. So we had kids writing every day, and what were they writing about? Well, the inquiry question was, what happens to the seed as in the life cycle? And they were supposed to use their reading and their hands-on experiments to understand and be able to explain the life cycle of a seed plant. One day of the unit, I had a whole class lesson on dramatic role play. So I prepared cards with all the vocabulary. I handed out the cards to individual students. So somebody was stigma, somebody was STEM, somebody was pollination. And then we kind of co-constructed what we should do with that. So I said, you guys, we're going to act out the life cycle of a seed plant. How should we do that? And it was pretty messy, and the kids all helped me figure out where objects should be, what should happen next, and we acted out the life cycle of a seed plant with the vocabulary cards. There was another day during the unit when I did a whole class activity with a graphic organizer. And again, I said, okay, guys, if we were going to draw a picture of what the life cycle of a seed plant is, what do you think it should look like, and what should be part of that? And together we constructed, should it be a line? Should it be a circle? They figured it all out with my facilitation. And then the next day, I asked partners to make their own graphic organizer of the life cycle of a seed plant. So they were using the vocabulary, maybe not in complete sentences here, but to visually express the idea of the life cycle of a seed plant. So how did they report out after all of this? reading, writing in journal, hands-on, writing in journal, acting out, graphic organizer. How did they report out the answer to the question of what happens to a seed in the life cycle? They always worked in partners, always, always, because I wanted there to be talk space around everything they did. So as partners, they talked to each other about what they were going to write. However, for the final product, each person did their own writing. And there were two ways I did this. One way was just to ask them to do an explanatory piece about the life cycle of a seed plant. The other way was to prepare a PowerPoint for them. Have you ever recorded talk into a PowerPoint? It's really easy to do with the PowerPoint software. So I prepared for a unit on the honeybee. I prepared a PowerPoint of honeybee with lots of pictures, and then I would call each student up and they would save it to their own name. And then their job was to write a script that would go with it to explain the life cycle of a honeybee. And then they practiced their skit over and over, and then they finally recorded it onto the PowerPoint. That way they could present without having to actually get up. You know, they could just sit down and we'd play their PowerPoint, and they loved doing that. And there was a lot of language involved in that. So here's how a possible schedule might look. So you see I put a science talk at the beginning of each week. Again, trying to allow for them to use the language at whatever level they could to talk about what they were learning and understanding and what questions they had about the life cycle. See, I put the drama about halfway through and the graphic organizer the next week. But every other day is partner reading and hands-on. If you were to walk into the traditional science classroom versus this classroom, the stark difference would probably be that the kids were talking for most of the lesson in the language-rich instruction. The question is, were they learning the science? If I wasn't in complete control of what everybody was reading every day and what everybody was saying every day, were kids learning science? Before I tell you the answer, here's a kindergarten variation. Instead of writing in journals for an emergent reader, we shared ideas by co-constructing a wall text on sentence strips. So every day after my read aloud, we would share, okay, what did we learn today? And I would write it on sentence strips, and then we would create a wall text. Because it's informational, notice how the text is arranged on the wall. Kind of factoidal. I'm kind of embarrassed. I did this about 15 years ago when I was teaching kindergarten. But because it's informational text, it doesn't read like narrative. There's not a beginning and you go to the end. It's more like category, category, category. That's what my wall text looked like in kindergarten. And on the shelf in front of that, those are all informational books about farms. And then I had a narrative wall text where, and this was when I had I was in kindergarten, I wasn't doing a basal system. So I could also be teaching this theme in my literacy block. So in the literacy block, I'd be doing narratives about the farm theme, and then we would create our own narrative for the narrative wall text. And as you can see, that was illustrated by the kids, and the story goes from left to right. It's structured differently because it's narrative. So in my kindergarten unit, I would still have science talks, I would still have drama, but instead of journal writing, I would have more of a shared writing lesson where we built wall texts. Okay. Now, here's how Common Core standards were in individual lessons in my unit. So I'm addressing the Common Core reading informational, those standards. I'm addressing speaking and listening. I'm addressing writing. I'm addressing language. All of those. I'm with a focus on language. But did they learn the science? So at the end of the unit, I had the children do, remember I gave them pre-tests? Say all the words you can think of, list all the words you can think of, picture point, and then I added 2 more tests. Tell me about the seed plant, the life cycle, and I taped what they said, and write about the life cycle of a seed plant. So I had all this data to look at and compare. What I found was the students in the language-rich instruction, as opposed to the textbook instruction, or traditional, the range of science vocabulary that they used in their writing and their talking was significantly greater. The density of specialized terminology was greater. The complexity of word use was greater. Okay, does that matter? What does complexity of word use mean? Well, if a child, and this was very tedious, grading all, or analyzing all these writing and speaking samples, but every time a child used a specialized term like stigma or fruit or soil, I stopped and looked at it and I rated it. Because so what if they're using all the words if they're using them wrong? So I wanted to see how complex is their knowledge of these words. So a word would get a 1 if they used the word but used it incorrectly, like this. A word like cirrus would get a 2 if they used it correctly but didn't really connect it to anything else. A word would get a score of 3 if they used the word correctly and were able to connect it to another thing, like droplets are formed when water condenses. That's a little more, that shows more interrelated knowledge of the word. And then a 4 and a 5 just meant they used more thought units to do that. So this child used 2 thought units to show relationship, and this child used 3. Rain falls down as precipitation. When rain hits the earth, it can become groundwater, or it can run off into lakes. That's a lot of connecting around the word rain. So that's a very complex use of the word rain. So what I found was that children in this language-rich instruction used words at a higher rating also. They were also more likely to use new words. How do I know what was new? Well, remember, I could see their pretest and I could see their post-test. So I marked what new words got added at the end, and are they using those in their writing? They were more likely to use new words than were the kids in the traditional. Did they understand the science? Yes. Did they express systems thinking to a greater extent? Yes. I was kind of surprised, honestly, because I was not that much in control of the content. I mean, a lot of the time was really spent with them reading, writing, talking, doing. So to close, I would like to show you what I mean by, because I showed you examples of children who differed in their ability to use the language. Now I want to show you the difference between kids who had a better or worse understanding of the model, the scientific model of the water cycle, this is, and systems thinking. And I want you to note that the high scores of conceptual understanding and systems thinking correlated with their vocabulary knowledge. So kids who made bigger gains in their language also scored higher on conceptual and systems thinking. I also want to note that this was the case for kids regardless of their previous PPVT score. So you might ask, well, this instruction, was it equally effective for kids who came in with a lot of language as for kids who came in with limited academic language? And my research showed that yes, it was. It was equally effective. Prior PPVT score did not predict how much they gained in language. The type of instruction they had predicted how much they would learn. Okay, so here's an example of a piece that would score a high score in conceptual understanding because of how much of the scientific model is expressed. I learned that water, like rivers, ocean, lakes, and streams, transforms into gas called vapor. It's cool because the sun makes the water heated, so it evaporates into the sky. And when the evaporated water reaches the cold sky, it turns into water droplets and forms clouds like cirrus clouds, cumulus clouds, and nimbostratus. Precipitation is when rain comes down. It's cool because the water that soaks in might get into groundwater. Groundwater is water underground that is almost like a stream. Then, when water percolates the soil in between rocks, water that precipitates is actually water that dinosaurs drank. That was hundreds of years ago. And all that water that clouds carry can go around the world or for hundreds and thousands of miles. That's a high score on the conceptual model. It's also high on systems thinking, isn't it? There's attributes in there, there's processes, there's cycle over time and place. That's a pretty complex text. Children were more likely to score high who received language-enriched science instruction. Here is a mid-level sample. The water, and in this sample, you're going to see some misconceptions, and they're in italics. The water evaporates and turns into water vapor. Water droplets mix together to form into clouds. It can form into cumulus clouds, nimbostratus clouds, or any cloud. Water cycle. The ocean's water evaporates into the air, and that is called water vapor. Water droplets mix and form into clouds. When the clouds have too much water, then it lets it out. It can precipitate as rain, snow, hail, or sleet. It goes into the lake and ocean. It starts all over again. So this child is representing a lot of the model, has a misconception about when the clouds get too heavy, that when the clouds have too much water, it lets it out. That's kind of a misconception. And this child is linking attributes into processes and then into a cycle. So that's a mid-level systems thinking score. And then this would be low on the conceptual model and low on the systems thinking. The water cycle is important to us. The sun helps the water evaporate more faster. Rain is never made. The water cycle has 3 parts. Did you know that fog starts after it rains, and when it dries up, it ends? The water cycle has many things to it, but the most important is water. There are many different clouds, like a stratus cloud and nimbostratus clouds or cumulus and many more. Did you know that on a humid day, your hair gets longer? The water cycle is a fun way to learn. Did you know that 70% of your body is made of water? Did you know that hail is made out of ice when it is 30 degrees? So this is a real good example of that factoidal nature of science. And I bet you can picture trade books right now that are full of these, right? Fabulous facts, quick facts, interesting facts. Anyway, this is still a work in progress for me. Like now what I need to do is interrogate it a little more and be more selective with my text choice. And I'd also like to be more intentional about gathering data about what happens during partner reading. I need to look at many aspects of this more closely. But my original goal was to set out and say, okay, theoretically there's this link between the vocabulary, language, and content. If I plan a unit to privilege language, which, darn it, means giving the kids time to talk and write and read, will they learn the science? And I found that they did, and as you can imagine, motivation was really, really high. So I continue this work. I encourage you to play with this kind of work and let me know what you find, and thank you very much for your time.